I'm Alex Rondinan, and welcome to If History Is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. In this episode, we will be reviewing the 2004 book All the Troubles, Terrorism, War, and the World After 9/11, written by Simon Adams, published by the Fremantle Art Centre Press. So join me. Of Australian imperialism is long, bloody and atrocious, but for far too long hidden from the mainstream discussion because of the openly pro-war and racist propaganda from the Ackerman-Bolt right and the left nationalist dribble from the Hamilton left. Ordinary Australians never actually properly learn of the crimes their country has committed over the centuries. But then a book like Simon Adams's All the Troubles comes along, breaking apart the lies and the gross historical inaccuracies, giving us an insight of the true horrors and miseries, and trying vainly to count the bodies. Australia's history begins with the civil war between the British settlers and the Aboriginal tribes from 1788 to approximately the 1870s, in which genocide, disease, torture, and rape were commonplace Australian characteristics. As Adams muttered, quote, "If the battle for physical control of Australia between settlers and Aborigines was not a war of conquest or a bloody civil war, then what was it? The learning of the Australian invasion, war, genocide, occupation and seizure should be compulsory for all schooling Australians. This country was founded on horror and murder, and it continued in this tradition for many decades to come. Australia had only just become a federated nation during the decade 1900s, and already its military history was being written. If there is any such thing as the Anzac spirit, then a proper definition to this spirit is the genocide of Indigenous peoples. After slaughtering the Aborigines at home, the Australian military was sent to New Zealand to kill the Maoris, and then over to South Africa to kill the Zulus. And then, when the native peoples were all done away with, it was time to defeat the world's first workers' revolution. Hundreds of Australian soldiers joined the proto-fascist White Russians, the military force that fought against the Bolshevik Reds, in an effort to defeat the 1917 Russian Revolution. Those White Russians were one of the most barbaric, inhumane military forces in all history, and by having Australian soldiers amongst its membership, this is hardly surprising. Australia today might be pro-Zionist, endlessly condoning and applauding Israeli terrorism upon the Palestinians, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an anti-Semitic history. In 1939, with the European Jewish migrants climbing onto boats and fleeing from German Nazism, Australia refused to protect them by allowing them into the country as refugees. But we shouldn't blame Australia alone for this. No Western country took any of the Jewish migrants. Australia has been involved in 16 or 17 wars, pending on interpretation, and has been attacked on the mainland only once by Japan. Only on this one case, during World War II and the Pacific War, could the case of self-defense be plausibly and reasonably argued. The rest were purely cases of invasion, terrorism, and murder. Ironically, Australia would never have been able to defeat the Japanese in the Southeast Asian Pacific area if it weren't for the assistance they received from the East Timorese militias, a favour that would soon be turned around into a bloody genocide where Australia would be implicit in an Indonesian massacre. Nationalists like to forget that Australia provided comprehensive diplomatic support to General Suharto of Indonesia, who in 1965 killed 500,000 people within a matter of weeks. As Time magazine reported, quote, "Travellers from those areas tell of small rivers and streams that have literally clogged with bodies," end quote. It was the Australian government that assisted in having that genocide come to reality. In 1975, during Indonesia's illegal invasion, occupation and annexation of East Timor, what did Canberra do about it? Prime Minister Gough Whitlam said at the time, quote, "Portuguese Timor should become part of Indonesia," end quote. Henry Kissinger and Suharto were close friends. Adams writes, quote, "Tim Fisher, Howard's deputy prime minister, had even gone so far as to describe General Suharto as perhaps the world's greatest figure in the second half of the 20th century," end quote. Not only did the Australian state commit acts of brutality, rape and pillage, but it also supported and applauded it when done by others, particularly its friends. As Suharto's regime began to fall apart and an East Timor independence movement was building, the horrors and brutality were ramped up to extreme levels. Beginning with the Dili massacre in 1991, there was a decade of oppression and genocide, whereby the attempt was made to repress and rape and brutalize East Timor into obedience and submission. Throughout the entire decade of these horrors, Australian Prime Ministers Keating and Howard did nothing to stop them. Also in the book, Simon Adams mentions those few brave journalists, such as John Pilger, Amy Goodman and Noam Chomsky, who risked their lives to enter East Timor and to report the insanity and sadism that was going on. Once East Timor finally did become an independent nation, it was time to divide up and negotiate the gas and oil within the Timor Sea. As Simon Adams writes, John Howard, by rejecting the East Timorese pleas to negotiate a final sea boundary based on international norms, end quote, drew the map decadently so as to steal $10 billion away from its rightful legal owner. Howard knew that what he was doing was illegal and immoral, so acutely aware that he pulled Australia out of relevant international jurisdiction conventions that would otherwise have prosecuted him for the crime he was committing. Without that money, East Timor could do nothing but fall into helpless, grotesque, endless poverty, with very little clean water, high illiteracy, child prostitution ever prevalent, etc. Australian nationalist Andrew Bolt is proud of the Australian military and John Howard because they liberated, quote unquote, East Timor. John Howard in 2003 said, "Australians are not by nature a warlike people. There is no tradition of conquest or imperial ambition. Such a comment is exactly opposite to the truth. As Australians, we must never forget that this country was founded on and continues to be about genocide, torture and rape, and the condemnation/advocacy when other people do it." Simon Adams's book is an important contribution into the true history of the Australian state. That's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to If History is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Alex Rondinan. Until next time, goodbye.